Hi, Rob.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter, to which everyone should subscribe. You are Rob Malley. You are someone who's been involved over the years repeatedly in attempts to find a lasting solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. In particular, at the kind of famous Camp David talks late in the Clinton administration, which some people depict as maybe the last best chance in retrospect to get a two-state solution. We can talk about that. I know you have some views on that aren't exactly in line with the establishment's views, and you were there. You have also been involved since then in more than once in dialogue with representatives of Hamas. One of those got you into trouble, or I guess I should say inaccurate reporting about it got you into trouble, and you wound up having to leave the Obama campaign because of that. We'll talk about that. Anyway, you've got a book out about this whole thing, about the whole history of trying to solve this problem. It's called Tomorrow is Yesterday, Life, Death, and the Pursuit of Peace in Israel-Palestine. And your co-author is Hussein Agha, who has also been recurringly involved in this on the Palestinian side. In fact, he was involved in Camp David, and in fact warned that it was really not an opportune time to try to do what Clinton wanted to do. And the book does a really good job of conveying the perspectives of various actors, the constraints operating on various actors, and frequently the failure of actors to understand the perspectives and constraints of the actors on the other side. And readers of my newsletter, Nonzero newsletter, may know that this is kind of a hobby horse of mine, cognitive empathy. Just understanding somebody's perspective. This isn't the same as emotional empathy, like feeling their pain. It's just understanding how they view the world. Failing to do that is often leads to failures to find cooperative solutions to non-zero-sum problems. So anyway, that's just a kind of a personal note. There's one more personal note, which is it's good to finally meet you because, as you know, more than 20 years ago, you and your current co-author, Hussein, wrote a pretty controversial piece in the New York Review of Books about the failure of Camp David. And you took issue with the kind of the line being pushed by the Clinton administration and pretty much everyone in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, that it was just clearly Arafat's fault. He was offered a state, mysteriously turned it down. It's more complicated than that, you would say. And I use that as my, acknowledged source text for a piece I wrote for Slate called Was Arafat the Problem? Which I'm still kind of proud of. But since you were the source text, thank you for that. So anyway, I want to spend a fair amount of time today kind of dissecting the whole Camp David experience, because in some ways it was paradigmatic of various problems. But first, since Gaza is on everyone's mind, you talk a little about in the book about various offers Hamas has made to Israel, peace offers, as a rule, not solutions to the problem, but more like truce things. And I think you say often Hamas did not understand, like, the Israeli frame of mind, if they were serious about some of these. But what was kind of the last, offer Hamas made before October 7th, and when was that?
So first, I want to thank you for having me. And since you referenced our article, I'll say that what you've written about cognitive empathy, I always assign to my students, because what I do now is teach. And that is kind of an obsession of mine, is trying to put myself in other people's shoes. And we could get into it or not, but we do in the book about my own background and how that's become sort of a professional trait, good or bad, of trying to not necessarily sympathize with or accept, but understand the perspective of others, which led me in one of my jobs when I was working for the International Crisis Group meeting with leaders of, meeting with Israeli settlers, but also meeting with leaders of Hamas, of Hezbollah, the Houthis, kind of people who tend to land on our terrorism list, and then we ignore them, don't understand them, but launch, attack them. And so, just trying to figure out what makes them, what is behind their worldview, understanding the limitations that are inherent in any such conversation. I'll come to your question, but as a segue, I know that when they're talking to me, they know who they're talking to, and so they will shape their message and their tone and everything to an audience that is a more Western audience and more American audience. So I never take what they say for granted. I know that there's propaganda in it, but I try to understand their worldview and where they're coming from, which at a minimum I think should inform how we react. It doesn't mean that we agree with them, but at least it informs, I think, how U.S. foreign policy should be shaped. Now, you're referring to an episode that we tell a bit in the book. It's more Hussein's episode than mine. He's been involved.
Can I just say the voice is remarkably constant, given the fact that different authors must have been the main authors of different texts. There was you did it well. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. We could get into how we did it, and we have fights. 10 fights a day, and then we land on something that both of us could live with and agree with. So Hussein was involved in some of these back-channel talks between Hamas and Israel. It's never a representative of Hamas and an Israeli official, but it was pretty clear on the Hamas side that the link was to Yahya Sinwar, the now deceased or killed leader of Hamas in Gaza, the mastermind of October 7th. On the Israeli side, it was a little less clear who they were talking for, and that was part of the problem, but some relationship to officialdom in Israel. And what Hussein witnessed was Hamas saying what it has said for some time. Again, you don't have to believe it, but it's just what they say, which is, let us govern, lift some of the blockade, let us be able to import what we need and to use and to fish the way the people need it, etc. And in exchange, we'll give you a truce, we'll give you calm for some amount of time, and then we could renegotiate it. I've heard that said by Hamas leaders ever since the blockade, ever since they won the elections in 2007 and the blockade was instituted. Again, as we say in the book, we understood Israel's reluctance, which was, well, yes, we're going to empower these people, and then one day they might turn their weapons against us because their belief system and their long-term view is inconsistent with ours. But at a minimum, I think, and one of the questions that comes through the book is if some version of that offer had been taken up, or, for example, if the United States and others had not pushed to prevent the election that was supposed to take place in 2021. Elections, as I'm sure everyone who's listening to us knows, haven't taken place since 2007. It's now, we're way past the time, the expiration date of every elected institution or representative in Palestine, in the West Bank or Gaza. And there's always been this fear, if we have elections, we're going to empower Hamas, they might win. But yes, that's possible. But at a minimum, it would have given Hamas maybe a different way out, more invested in politics than in what they invested in. Again, we're not predicting that if either the Israeli Hamas back channel discussions had ended up in something that would have given Hamas some of what it wanted and given Israel some of what it wanted, or if the elections had taken place. We're not saying October 7th wouldn't have happened. But certainly it's worth thinking about alternative histories because the history that we went through is one that led to this disaster.
And when was the last time that Hamas was making this offer, which I gather was just like, you loosen up the blockade, you let our fishermen venture further from our coast than the strict limits, and so on, and you won't have to worry about intermittent rocket fire and various other things. That was kind of the basic deal. And when? Well, first of all, you can correct that. But when was this?
So again, Hussein attended the last meeting. It was only a few months. I think it was the summer of 2023. So we're talking about soon before October 7th. It never went anywhere. Obviously, the Israelis didn't respond positively, and then Hamas did what it did on October 7th. I could hear the skeptics already saying, well, this was all a ruse, and Hamas was never serious about trying to get its troops. And again, I don't have an answer. The people who could speak authoritatively are now all underground and buried. But
Mm-hmm.
It is a recurrent theme, and every time there has been a war between Israel and Hamas, and those goes back to the earlier 2000s, and every time they've been concluded with a kind of deal whereby Israel would loosen the siege, and every deal that the U.S. mediated or others mediated, and in exchange there would be a truce. That's always been the terms of the deal. And then Israel doesn't really live up to it, the Palestinians don't really live up to it, and then they break down. What has never really been tried is a long-term sustained effort to loosen the siege. And there has to be a lesson taken from all of this. The siege that was imposed, again, after the elections, after Hamas won, after Israel withdrew, quote unquote, from Gaza, the siege has to be viewed as one of the catastrophic mistakes. Forget about, it's hard to forget the humanitarian consequences that the siege had on ordinary Gazans, again, well before October 7th. The open-air prison that people were describing was not a result of October 7th. It preceded it. So for putting aside those humanitarian effects, what did it do? It empowered the most hardline elements of Hamas. It convinced them that the only way forward was violence. And it empowered them also because we could talk about the impact of sanctions throughout the world, Iran, elsewhere, that I've looked at. It tends to strengthen the people who have power already, who have guns, who have the ability to control the distribution system. And so what you had is Hamas strengthened its stranglehold on the economy, on politics, on the military situation. Is that the result is that the ideal result from the situation? It really is again, one of those self-inflicting wounds to impose the siege. It hurt the people in Gaza. Ultimately, it hurt Israel.
Although I'm sure there's a view in Israel, I would imagine Bibi Netanyahu holds it sincerely, that this has all worked out well, that it's given them a chance to kind of more or less neuter Hezbollah, Iran, Hamas. And yes, the world hates Israel now, but I think the idea, a pretty prevalent idea in Israel has long been, look, the world is going to more or less hate us regardless. We got to do what we got to do, right?
Yeah.
So is everything I've just said, you think accurately depicts a certain fairly prevalent view in Israel?
And not just in Israel. I mean, some of former Biden administration officials have come out in recent months and said, yeah, it was pretty ugly. But at the end of the day, we are in the Middle East where Iran is neutered, Hezbollah is neutered, Hamas is almost defunct. We have to deal with the Houthis, but who are they? So I think there is a view, certainly in Israel, as I said, in some quarters of the U.S., that, yeah, there's 70,000 or plus Gazans who are dead. There's a humanitarian catastrophe. There's genocide. They wouldn't admit to the genocide, but they would say the situation is terrible. But strategically, aren't we better off? And again, we try to reflect that view among Israelis. And part of the theme of the book, the title of the book, Tomorrow's Yesterday, is that so much of what we're looking at today has been features of decades past. Israelis convinced that the only language that the Palestinians will understand is force, and that the whole issue of the Iron Wall and reaching out to kill your enemies before they attack you, and Palestinians feeling distraught without any option other than perhaps acts of violence of their own and not having a leadership that represents them. So we could go through these themes, but everything we're seeing today, we've seen before, which should at least make us question everything that's been done in the past, again, including how the treatment of Gaza, but just the treatment of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict writ large. So yes, I think the Israelis feel this. Again, if you look at history shows that military successes are never permanent. And the Middle East is littered with these victories, people mission accomplished, claiming that the end is near, successful end is near, only to see history's revenge. And I hear Israelis say, "How could we forget the trauma of October 7th? We needed to do what we did to overcome it, and we still haven't overcome it." I hear that, and again, understand that perspective. Try to put yourself in the shoes of a Palestinian, certainly a Palestinian in Gaza, who's lost everything. Father, mother, son, daughter, the entire family, their possessions, their homes, who've been forced to flee once and then flee from the place that they fled. They were bombed, and then they're bombed in the place where they were told to take refuge. what generation of anger, of fury, of thirst for vengeance is this going to give rise to? I suspect that applies to Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but elsewhere, who feel solidarity with their brethren, and many Arabs who will feel the same way. So I could see that from an Israeli perspective today looks better, and they will say, we defeated our enemies. Anyone who wanted to harm us is now in no position to do so. And certainly the expectation that if we attacked Hamas or Hezbollah or the Iranians, we Israelis would be suffering, consequences of enormous magnitude. They'd say, look, what have we suffered, right? So I get all that. But if you're looking for a long-term sustainable arrangement, you've planted the seeds of anger, violence, and as we say, not something it's not going to be October 7th. It's not going to be the first intifada. It's not going to be the second intifada. Something different, something new. At the same time, a reenactment of it.
Yeah, now Israel has killed a lot of not just actual kind of Hamas soldiers, but I think a lot of males of fighting age. I am guessing that their targeting criteria were in that particular regard.
Any male over the age of 18, they're considered a Hamas member. That's in their numbers.
So they just killed them. If they see a young male, they killed him.
And by the way, the vast majority of that, I think, is now admitted by almost everyone, are civilians. So I think there's no doubt.
So, but I've got to think. I mean, and even 17-year-olds look 18, 16-year-olds look 18. So I'm sure a lot of older teenage males are dead now. But at the same time, if you look at the number of males between the ages of like 9 and 14 who now have close relatives killed or maimed by Israel, you got to think that if there's another round of recruiting for not just soldiers, but suicide bombers, you got to think the recruiter's going to be in pretty good shape.
But when you've lost everything, you've got nothing to lose. I mean, and listen, even American officials under Biden were saying that Hamas had managed to recruit as many people as it had lost, perhaps more. Again, I don't know those statistics. They certainly don't have the weaponry that they had before. But in terms of a generation of Palestinians who have grown up with nothing to lose and whose only memory they'll have is of what just happened in Gaza, because they'll have nothing else. Yes, that's a very dangerous combustible mix that has been.
Yeah, I don't know if this matters. I think some viewers will think it matters, but I just want to say you're Jewish. I say that because Malley is not a recognizably Jewish name.
It was not my father's original name. He was asked to change it as a journalist, but his original name was Minash, which is more Jewish.
Now, you have a very unusual background. Your father's from the Middle East and so on, and maybe we'll have time to get into that. But anyway, invariably, there are people wondering, like, why isn't he spending more time talking about Israel's point of view? But actually, you already have, and you do in the book. And that is the great thing.
If I could just add one thing, what you were saying earlier about, has Israel won or lost? I've tried to present the case that in the long term, this is just the beginning of a long movie, and who knows where it will end. I could imagine many Israelis would say, listen, these people were determined to kill us anyway. So you tell me we have a generation of people who hate us. They hated us before. And rather, we are in a better position, having neutered them, having destroyed them, having shown that there's a real price to pay when you try to kill an Israeli. I think that's a perspective, which is why we are back where we've been decades past, where both sides cannot see a common future, and where each side believes the other one is out to get them completely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The one question I would raise about whether this is going to come back to haunt Israel in the ways we're imagining is, and I don't want to spend much time on this. I want to get to Camp David, but we can get back to it, I think, later in the conversation. But I've got to think there are people in Israel who are saying, look, let's just put them somewhere else. I mean, the wholesale ethnic cleansing of Gaza is definitely on some people's minds. They're talking about finding a country for them. There is what looks to me like a kind of more incremental ethnic cleansing going on in the West Bank, with settlers terrorizing Palestinians and more settlements being built and authorized. And although you don't hear so much about this, I've got to think there are people in Israel saying quietly, look, we'll push the ones in the West Bank into Jordan and we'll, or whatever they would do, right? And at that point, I guess they would say, look, this all worked. I mean, if they did the wholesale ethnic cleansing of the West Bank and Gaza, and maybe you think that's even given how extreme recent Israeli policy has been in general, maybe you think that's just not in the cards for one reason or another, but I'm sure they're thinking about it. Somebody's thinking about it, and
100%. And again, I hate to come to sound like a broken record. Tomorrow's yesterday. These are ideas that have been around among elements of the Israeli political spectrum from the beginning. From the beginning. And again, I mean, Palestinians had the ideas also of some of them of getting rid of Israeli Jews. But on the Israeli side, in terms of thinking of getting rid of the people of Gaza, that go back and read what some Israeli leaders were saying in the 60s. You know, where could we expel the Gazans? To Iraq, to Libya, wherever. Those ideas have come back because now and for some it's a moment of opportunity. They think now's the time when we could finally put into practice ideas we've had for a long time. Palestine, you know, there's 22 Arab nations. Why don't the Palestinians go live there? There's only one Jewish state. Jordan is Palestine. If they're next door, they're going to try to kill us. In the West Bank, as you say, there's been this, you know, people are alarmed by the possibility of formal annexation. Fine. But there's de facto annexation taking place every day, displacement of population. A statistic I just saw, which really struck me, is that since October 7th, settlers in the West Bank, through violence and other means, often with the backing of the Israeli Defense Forces, have taken over 3 times as much territory as the entire size of Gaza. So things are happening, and there are these old ideas which have rooted in the past, more rooted than the two-state solution, as we argue in the book, expulsion, ethnic cleansing, other ideas. And on both sides, there's a moment now where all these ideas are back on the table because I think most have concluded that the notion of a two-state solution, and we could come to that, and the recent wave of recognition of the Palestinian state, I think most people deep down know it's simply not going to happen, or at least not going to happen in a meaningful way with a sovereign, contiguous Palestinian state. And so all these other ideas, from binational state to ethnic cleansing to confederation, all of those are slowly coming back to the surface.
Okay. So let's talk about Camp David. This is at the very end of the Clinton administration. What is the date when the actual talks began? What month?
It's in July 2000.
Okay, so, you know, there's not much time left. Clinton's kind of finally getting serious about a two-state solution, and Ehud Barak, who was the prime minister of Israel, is also kind of finally getting serious because he's been saying, no, our priority is some kind of deal with Syria. I don't have time for the Palestinians. That failed. The Syrian initiative fails. And so, okay, he's ready. Now, Arafat is talked into coming, although he doesn't seem especially eager. And, you know, in terms of understanding what he's thinking and what constraints are acting on him, I think that's inherently challenging for people for 2 reasons. Yeah. First of all, we kind of naturally don't get that inquisitive about certain aspects of our adversaries' worldviews. I'll tell you a story. Like 15 years ago or something, I was at a cocktail party at the New York Times, and I met a guy who was on the foreign editing desk. And I forget the name of the Jerusalem bureau chief at the time. You'd recognize the name. But I said, you know, I read his stories. I've noticed something. When Netanyahu does something kind of like bad, that's not going to play well. Like within about 3 paragraphs, he's describing the political constraints, the political reason Netanyahu does this. But when the Palestinians do something bad, I almost never see anything in the entire story explaining like why for them now was the time for missile strike. And sometimes it's like a straightforward retaliation for something Israel did, and you still don't read about what Israel did. But that's like a natural human thing. And I actually think this bureau chief's son was in the IDF. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, or had been maybe. But But anyway, if you view somebody as your adversary, there's a particular cognitive bias known as attribution error that discourages you from explaining the bad things they do in terms of their circumstance. You just want to attribute it to what bad people they are. And that's what we all do, naturally.
Yeah.
So there's another problem, generic problem, for people who live in democracies, maybe especially, which is that we look at Netanyahu and they say, well, here's the problem. There's this coalition, blah, blah, blah. We understand that language. We understand how politics works in a democracy. And when we think of somebody as an autocrat, whether it's Xi Jinping or somebody who runs not a state but an organization like Arafat, we think, well, they can just do whatever they want, right? And we don't, or at a minimum, if we suspect their constraints, we have no idea of how to think about what they are. So I'd like you to talk, first of all, like, what kinds of things did Arafat have to worry about? What's on his mind politically? Everyone has their politics. Like, what were his?
Right. So a lot of stuff, good pieces in the question you asked. But first, why do we devote a chunk of the book to Camp David? Hussein and I debated it. One of the big arguments that we had. But in the end, the reason we devote so much time is partly the point you made. It's used today as sort of a microcosm, as a sort of illustration of everything that's wrong with the Palestinians. And I've heard former President Clinton and former First Lady Hillary Clinton invoke it and say, when we tell young Americans who are protesting today, when we remind them what we offered, my husband or me offered the Palestinians, they are sort of surprised. And sometimes there's this hint of, all of this is kind of their fault because of if Arafat had said yes, he'd have a state and everything would be fine. And so if this is the two-word answer to, everything that's gone wrong, it's Camp David, we felt we needed to come back and revisit and deepen a bit the analysis along the terms that you said. So that's sort of number one. Number two, on the question about understanding both sides' politics. I mean, it is so true. And it's not just in this case that the United States didn't recognize the constraints that Arafat was under or the politics that he had to navigate. Is that we not only understood, we exaggerated often the politics and the circumstances that the Israeli side was under. So now we sort of the asymmetry between the two sides, which ideally the U.S. would have corrected. In fact, the U.S. exacerbated. So, for example, Ehud Barak, before negotiating with the Palestinians, he ignored them completely. He decided that he would not implement the modest agreement that his predecessor, a certain Benjamin Netanyahu, had negotiated with Arafat about withdrawal from more territory in the West Bank. Barak said, I can't do that. If I do that, it's going to cost me politically, and I need my political assets, credit, to negotiate a bigger deal. That was number one. Number two, he said, settlement expansion is going to continue, but don't worry if it continues. Again, because if we get a deal, that land, the settlements that are going to be incorporated in the Palestinian state will be incorporated in the Palestinian state. The settlements that will be incorporated in Israel will be incorporated in Israel, so don't worry. And by the way, I'm going to focus on Syria because that's a much more serious conflict. What happens in Malley is sort of what happens on a hill. What happens in Damascus is a real serious state. So Arafat is under this position where the person who is supposed to be more peace-minded than Netanyahu wants to renegotiate a deal that was struck with Netanyahu, is ignoring the Palestinians, is turning a blind eye to settlement expansion or enabling it, and is saying things, if you just look at what he's saying, is not at all conducive to a sense of trust. So Arafat hears all that, and when the Syrian talks fail between Barak and Assad, and we could get into that, he says, my political conditions here are I just can't do this. I don't trust the Barak. Nobody in Palestine trusts it. We can't go for this major deal because we think it's a trap. And when he speaks about his own politics, what he needs, it's viewed as an excuse, right? President Clinton and his team, of which I was a part, tended to say, well, when Arafat invoked his politics, it's because he wants to avoid the moment of decision. Whereas when Barak mentions his politics and invokes it, it's because he wants to prepare the ground for this historic agreement. So again, we turn a blind eye to settlement construction, but anytime Arafat hints at anything, like unilateral declaration of a Palestinian state, which he had said, oh, if you do that, you're going to completely crater the peace process. You can't do it, even if you say you need to do it in order to strengthen your legitimacy. And can
I ask you, don't forget what you're going to say, but who does Arafat have to worry about? In other words,
that's exactly what I was going to say.
What is his constituency, and
So-
what is he worried they'll do if they don't approve of a deal he makes?
So, I mean, this goes again to the point you're making, that we have this tendency, if mirror imaging, where we say, well, Netanyahu's a Democrat or Barak is, so we understand he has to do the constraint. Arafat is a despot, so he could ignore domestic politics. As we say in the book, sometimes it's the opposite, right? I mean, the Israeli leader has legitimacy, institutions, is elected, is represented, blah, blah, blah. The Palestinian side, I mean, put yourself in Arafat's shoes. He has no state. He has very few resources. His survival is based on his balancing competing power bases. That's how he survived. And some people like it, some people don't. But it is an achievement on his part to have survived with absolutely nothing, and with having made enemies of virtually every Arab leader, on our terrorism list, et cetera, et cetera. So his survival depended, as we said, on having the finest political nose around. And to
his
smell.
Political survival, you mean? I guess at some points, maybe his physical survival, I don't know. But
and he did say, what he told Clinton is, if I agree to what you've told me, which is betraying our sacrosanct principles on Jerusalem, on territory, on refugees, you'll be walking behind my funeral, at my funeral. That's what he had said.
He was saying extremists in somewhere in the Palestinian coalition.
And also that he would lose all legitimacy. And if he wanted, what would be the point of getting a deal if that deal would be viewed as illegitimate by the vast majority of Palestinians? So, again, this is not a defense of one or the other, but if we're going to apply a political lens, as you say, to the Israelis, it was odd that we were completely oblivious, and by we I mean the American team, and Ehud Barak was so concerned about his own politics and so dismissive of the politics of his counterpart. And, you talk about, just an aside, about sort of cognitive empathy. I don't know how you would describe the kind of empathy that Ehud Barak had, which was a sight to behold. He was like a chess player who was so convinced that he was the master of the game that he knew exactly how you, Bob, would play. And if your queen moved in the wrong direction, he'd cry foul. That's not the way the game is supposed to be played. You get it all wrong. So he thought that he knew exactly what the other side wanted. I don't know, I wouldn't call that empathy, but it was presumed empathy. And it was just, he would stew whenever the Palestinians reacted in ways that he felt was contrary to his conception.
Yeah, you say so. The stories about the two. I mean, the thing I'd long heard about Arafat is he kept just saying no and not countering. He didn't say no, I won't accept that. This is what I'll accept. He just at Camp David kept saying no. But you say in the book, I think that Barak refused to engage Arafat. Does that ring a bell? Like as if he. Yes. He would talk to him, right? He would talk to him, wouldn't he, personally?
No. I mean, they had this one dinner together and where Barak would barely look at Arafat. And then after that, he would tell Clinton, who said, wait a minute, you're the guy who kind of forced my hand and said, we need this summit. The only way we're going to get the Palestinians to agree is if they're in this pressure cooker where they see either they get a deal and they get what they get, or it's the end. No relation with the U.S., no relation with the world. They're going to be squashed. That was Barak's conception. You need the pressure of a summit of 2 weeks, all or nothing, which again, you could imagine in response to your earlier question, what that made Arafat feel. This is a trap where the Americans and the Israelis are together presenting me with an all or nothing proposal, and the all is not all that I want at all, and the nothing, I could live with it. It's better than accepting this.
So Barak wouldn't talk to him face to face.
On your question, Barak would say to Clinton, no, I don't want to meet with him. Because if I meet with him, he's going to pocket my concession and then go out to the world and say, Barak had said X, Y, or Z, and he'll lie about it. So there was one, Clinton was very close to Barak, but he could be infuriated by his behavior. And that was one thing where he felt, what was the point of a summit? We could have done this, by shuttle if you're not prepared to meet with him. But Barak was so convinced that Arafat's goal was to trap him and to make him make concessions, and then he would say nothing. Now, on the question of did the Palestinians make any concessions, what we've written is we think, when we wrote this back in 2001 in the article you referenced, that the Palestinians were overly passive, that they should have been countering more aggressively. Now, they would say our position was well known, right? We made our historic concession back in the 1980s when we agreed that Israel would that we would only have a state on the 22% of mandatory Palestine that constitutes the West Bank and Gaza. In other words, we're conceding 78%. That's our main concession. So we want all the land of the West Bank and Gaza. We want East Jerusalem all of East Jerusalem as our capital, although Arafat did say at Camp David, the Jewish neighborhoods, settlements in East Jerusalem, he would be prepared for them to be under Israeli sovereignty. And a solution for the refugees, this was a really tough one, that would fulfill their rights, although they would say, we understand that we can't threaten the Jewish character of the state of Israel, but they never came up with a real answer. So they would say, we had a proposal. Israeli proposal, yeah, we may have said no, but Israel said no to our proposal. They would never agree to withdraw entirely from the land. They were never prepared to do anything meaningful for the refugees. They were never prepared for us to have our capital in all of East Jerusalem, minus the settlements. So, it's not the same, but there really was this sense among the Palestinians that they were being asked to negotiate over and above the compromise, to compromise over and above the compromise they feel they have already made. And so the Palestinian position, basically for the official Palestinian non-Hamas position, since the 1980s, has not really changed. It's been pretty constant. Whereas the Israeli position is harder to pin down. It has changed. And at Camp David, as we write, Barak did move quite a bit from traditional Israeli positions. The problem was he was moving from, the distance that was measured was how far he'd moved from Israel's initial position, not how far he had moved towards the Palestinian position. And Camp David, in hindsight, nothing was agreed. Not territory, not Jerusalem, not refugees, not security. There was no agreement. There was no on-paper proposal. That's another one of these myths, as if it was a peace deal, as in the first Camp David that President Carter negotiated. That never happened. We recount the story. One of the first days, the Americans, put a proposal on the table, a full proposal. Barak blew up, said, you can't do this because it's crossing too many of my red lines. And then Arafat said the same thing. And so what the president decided, the American president, Clinton, decided was, forget about the paper. It's null and void. So that's sort of the first and last time that the U.S. at Camp David put a full-fledged proposal on the table. After that, it was just sort of ideas that were mentioned.
Yeah, I've always thought that maybe the only way to get a deal would be for the U.S. to just say, here's the deal. Yeah. And figure out, talk more to the Palestinians in advance than they are accustomed to talking to Palestinians in advance. Have a sense that it could work for them. And they have a lot of leverage with Israel, a lot. Yeah. Now, we can get into domestic political constraints, but I've always thought in my ideal world, like if you imagine, how do you, meet the very, challenging, solve the very challenging problem of bringing these two together and agreeing on something, the U.S. has to lay it down and say, you're doing it or there are serious consequences. So in terms of the specifics of the deal, and one reason Camp David is important is because, there is this refrain, the Palestinians have never missed an opportunity. To miss an opportunity, they've been offered a state, they didn't want one. You heard this after October 7th. If you started to explain why October 7th happened, which was a perilous undertaking right after October 7th, because people always mistake attempts to just kind of causally explain why things happen with attempts to excuse their happening, even if that's not your intention. But you did hear this. Look, we've offered the Palestinians a state. And one thing I say, and I said in the Slate article based on your piece is, first of all, they weren't offered anything that any of us would call a state. I mean, they weren't going to get control of their airspace. They weren't going to get control of their borders. They weren't going to be allowed to have basically a military. I mean, if you're, a country that is your adversary, if not enemy, can fly over your airspace at any point. That's not. They were also going to have the power to, I think, cut the state in half at any point. They could close off some. It was. Yeah. But all that. So anyway, look. Just to be clear, Palestinians have never been offered a state in the sense that any of us means a state. But there was one other thing about what they were offered that really got my attention, because it just seems kind of inexplicable that this was Israel's offer. I'm sure you can tell me it's as far as Barak thought he could go, but it's the land swap thing. So there was this, look, you've got this problem. There's these settlements. on what under international law is not Israel's territory. And in fact, under most interpretations of the Geneva Conventions, the settlements are a clear violation of international law because the conventions prohibit the transfer of civilian populations to into territory acquired by force, regardless of who started the war. I'm sure there are dissenting views on that, but I would say that I call it kind of a mainstream interpretation. Anyway, that's certainly the way the Palestinians are looking at it. Okay, these settlements, they're not supposed to be there, and you're saying they can't move. So you're saying, yes, we'll go back to the 1967 lines before Israel took all its territory, except for X, Y, and Z, all these settlements, and they're not nothing, and they're on some good land and so on. So they have this idea. How about land swaps? The settlements that just have to stay, that you just can't remove, there will be compensation in terms of land that Israel gives to Palestine. That's in what is now Israel will be given to Palestine. But what you think is okay. It's going to be a 1-to-1 swap, right? And I mean, that's just what you would naturally, the logic of what this is a solution to, seems to make it kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah.
But what Israel offered is 9-to-1, right, in Israel's favor, right? As I recall, that was the opening offer, and I don't think it ever, even at Taba, got to 1-to-1. But
no.
What's going on? I mean, just to finish my thought, it seems to me like that's not. It's like if you want to bargain them down to 1-to-1, like you're worried they're going to want a swap in a ratio in their favor, or if you want to bargain them down to 2-to-1, I still wouldn't start at 9-to-1 because that's just an insult, right? I mean, that's just a way to get them to leave the talks. I don't know.
Again, there's so much in what you said. Let me see if I could react to a few. First, for people who say, as a former president does, Palestinians never miss an opportunity. There was this great offer. Shlomo Ben Ami, who was at Camp David, the Israeli foreign minister at the time, he has written since that if he had been Arafat, he would have rejected the offer because of all the reasons he gives. So let's put that aside, the question that Arafat should have said yes. But there's so much at stake in the framing, right? An Israeli offer. We got to keep the settlements because how could we withdraw from the settlements that are closer to the 67 line? And we'll give you something in exchange. It won't be 1-to-1. As you said, Camp David was like 9-to-1. Then it did improve somewhat, but never 1-to-1. And of course, it wasn't the same quality of land, the better quality of land, the one that's more irrigated, et cetera, that's more fertile would be Israeli. Why would Arafat agree to that, right? Okay, put that aside. But the framing was, we Israelis won the war. And put yourself in their shoes. They say, as the one who won the war, not only 1948, all the Arabs and Palestinians rejected the idea of a Jewish state. They tried to destroy it. We won. Then in 67, and they go on in the history, and they say, so since when does the victor in a war is told, now you got to restore the territory? No, we're being magnanimous, we're being generous. Again, the expression, the most generous offer, which is so insulting to the Palestinians. I mean, put them in their shoes. What do you mean an offer? It's our land that you took away. You owe it to us. It's not. You're not being generous. It's not an offer. This is our due. So both sides, you really have this completely clashing perspective, which explains why the Israelis believe that the offer at Camp David and the American team, for the most part, believe that the offer, if there was an offer, was generous. And just back to the issue that we were talking earlier about cognitive empathy. I remember when I first joined the U.S. team, I think Shimon Peres at the time, who was prime minister, had said something about how he wasn't prime minister when I joined. But I forget who it said. Some Israeli leader had said, "We're prepared to relinquish 80% of it." And the American team, most members thought that was extraordinary. 80%. Why would they do that? And I remember saying at the time, and I was joined in that by another member of the team, Gamal Halal, who was an advisor of Egyptian origin. And both of us said, but isn't the logical answer what you said? If we have to explain to the Palestinians as mediators an outcome, I always felt I have to be able to explain it in ways that convince me. 1-for-1 is explainable. Even then, they'd have to say, well, why do they hold on to any of the territory? Settlements are illegal, as you pointed out. Well, it's realistic. They're not going to evacuate all the settlements. It's just a small percentage, and we'll have a swap. But we thought one for one, we could at least make the case. But we were outvoted, of course, and that was not what was on in the American mind. But there was really this sense the Israelis are going so far because they won, and they're now prepared to give the spoils of their victory to the defeated party, not just the defeated party, but the defeated party that even denied their right to exist a few decades ago. I think that really permeated the whole. That's why Camp David is so instructive, because I think both sides came from it from a very different point of view. The Palestinians thought we're here if they thought a deal was possible, which Arafat didn't at that point. But if we're going to get a deal, it has to be one that does justice to our claims. And the Israelis were looking at it. We're going to pay off the Palestinians because they lost. We're going to pay them off, and in exchange, they have to provide us with security. So the Palestinian Authority, or the Palestinian, if it were to be a state, it's going to have to police its own. We, Israel, are going to maintain the overwhelming security prerogative, as you said, of controlling the border, controlling the airspace, what comes in, what comes out. Because, again, we're being generous by offering our enemy, the ones who wanted to destroy us, a piece of land that they're going to be able to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got to remember, I mean, Arafat's constituency consists, largely of people who either were displaced from their homes or are the offspring of those. Yeah. I mean, when back then there were a number of people alive who remembered being displaced from their homes,
right.
And in addition, I mean, first of all, a lot of now it's more like children and grandchildren. So in Gaza, there's a lot of that, right? They were displaced from Israel proper. In the West Bank, quite a few. And then there are all the diaspora politicians, Palestinians who are in Lebanon or wherever. And they, too, have this grievance. And the grievance is central to the Palestinian narrative, of course, that they deserve to go back to their actual homes. And I guess I'd say two things about that and see what you think about them. One is, I'm not sure Israel understood that if you're asking them to give up on that aspiration, which Israel always was, they were never going to give them a pure right of return. So anyone who had ancestors in Israel proper or Israel behind the Green Line can go back. I mean, that's just not going to happen. I mean, even I'm not a scholar of the Middle East, but I can tell you that if you're Israel, that's just no. And I think on the one hand, maybe Israel, I think Israel needed to understand that if you're asking them to surrender that, like that is so central to the narrative. Yeah. And then you want Arafat to go to his people and say, well, yeah, you're not getting that. Oh, and also they're doing 9-1 on the land. I mean, that just seems like a crazy ask. At the same time, I will say, I don't know. You can tell me, did the Palestinians understand how unrealistic true right of return is? Yes. It seemed to me that was their big ask that was inherently a huge stumbling block.
So again, great question. I think the Palestinian officials we spoke to will all say, we know that all the Palestinians, the refugees can't return, right? They were focused mainly on the Palestinians in Lebanon because that was their biggest headache. But you're right to say the Palestinian movement at its inception is a refugee movement. Arafat is a refugee. The whole PLO leadership is refugees. And their aspiration for decades was not, we want a state. Borders of 67 is, as you say, we want to return. So it is a huge sacrifice. And whenever somebody hints at saying no right of return, they get excoriated on the Palestinian side. But I do think the leadership knew, yes, we're not going to flood Israel with refugees. And that's why I say, I don't think they were ever able themselves to come up with an answer. They negotiated numbers, how many thousands of refugees could come back. And obviously they didn't settle on something that both sides would agree to. But it is, I mean, I could confess that as an American negotiator, I had underestimated, just because of what you said, it just seemed unrealistic and so at odds with the existence of a Jewish state. But I'd underestimated for some time, how you can't ignore it. And that's why so much of the book is about sort of the illusions that have been peddled about a two-state solution, because if it's really a solution, as Barak had said, that has to end the conflict and end all claims. You have to come to terms with what has animated the Palestinians since 1948, which is the Nakba, which is the catastrophe that befell them, and the 700,000 people who were forced from their homes. And you have to come to terms, of course, with the Israeli side and their narrative and their fears of the Palestinians, their fear of being eradicated, and of course today the 700,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. And it's why you could find an arrangement with something that looks like a Palestinian state, but if you're going to resolve the conflict, our conclusion after many years of trying and failing to get a two-state solution is you have to grapple with history, because that is so intrinsic and inherent to the consciousness, the emotions, the yearnings of both sides. And that's what, as negotiators, and particularly as American negotiators, we tended to think that's just too complicated.
Well, what do you mean by grapple with history?
I mean, the perspective of history, that this is not a conflict that began in 1967, and the solution that was discussed at Camp David and since have only been about 67. Let's draw a line on the map, divide, parts of the West Bank, Gaza, the rest of Israel, security arrangements, and call it a day. But how does that address the historical feelings of Palestinians, as you mentioned, born of 1948, and how does it address the deeper fears of Israelis that at some point you have the state, and then at some point they're going to come back and revive the claim of Palestinian citizens of Israel or of refugees who are going to say the state is illegitimate. And I think so much of the negotiations were trying to ignore what we call the ghosts of the past, but the ghosts of the past have the final say. And that's why, it's hard to think of alternatives to the two-state solution, but I think we have to, because we bumped our heads against it. At a time, at Camp David, the circumstances were far, far, far more auspicious for a two-state solution than they are today. Forget about what happened on October 7th if you can, but just the settlement construction, everything that's happened, we're so far from it. And now we're going to go back and simply say, well, let's try again what we failed in 2000, and we failed again in 2005, and failed again in 2014, again, under far more auspicious circumstances.
Yeah, I've been to Israel twice. Last time I was there was 2010. It was like a tour of the West Bank, kind of left-wing tour, breaking the silence. People were, showing us stuff. And it's funny. I got back and I was, I got on a small plane to join my family on vacation. And I found myself sitting next to John Kerry. And I pulled out, I think in order to get his attention, to see if he'd want to strike out a conversation, I pulled out this map of like Israel and the territory. And he said, "Oh, do you have a solution?" And I said, "Actually, what I've decided is it's too late for a two-state solution." That was my feeling then.
Then you were ahead of me, and I'm not surprised.
He could have saved himself a lot of time if he had taken my sage counsel. But anyway, one more. I've always thought on the return thing, if there was any hope, it was okay. Everyone else, all the refugees outside of Israel, can come to what will now be the state, and then I think there would also have to be some kind of financial compensation. You might want to get a few billionaires involved or something. I don't know, but
that was, in fairness, that was the idea that Clinton had put forward. I think there are other ideas today, which I don't want to leave the impression, people who haven't read the book yet, that this is sort of not just a requiem for the two-state solution, but for any solution. Because I think there's sort of this fake optimism of saying today, recognize a Palestinian state, we're going to get there, two-state solution. That's a lethal sort of optimism because it's led us to where we are today. But I think we have to be more creative. And there are ideas out there. I'm not going to not spend much time on them, but there are ideas out there. Is there a way to allow refugees to visit, perhaps even take residence in parts of Israel, and for the settlers to stay, so that it is, it's more of a confederation, it's more of a loose lines. It's not a hard line between Israel and Palestine. There's a way to validate the desires of many Israeli Jews to be able to go anywhere on the land of mandatory Palestine between the river and the sea, and the desire for many Palestinians to do the same. I'm not here to say that's the blueprint. We should negotiate that, But the point is, we need to open our minds because everything that has been tried in the past to achieve a two-state solution has failed, and it has become sort of a gadget, a gimmick that allows the perpetuation of the status quo. So you have leaders saying two states, and on the ground, as you just said, and between 2010 and today, as you hinted, the situation is much, much worse.
Oh.
It's really undoing the scrambled eggs that it's.
That's exactly the metaphor that came to mind. When you understand it's not just a bunch of isolated settlements. There are highways among them. The Palestinians can't drive on the highways, so it's harder for them to get from one place to another because there's this highway they can't just cross. And
you mentioned Secretary Kerry, who, God bless him, he really believes in it, tried everything. But he said, I think in 2014 or 15, we're 2 minutes to midnight. In a few years, there's no two-state solution. It's over. I just heard President Macron saying, we're 2 minutes to midnight. It's over. I mean, at some point, the clock has to actually move.
Yeah.
And I've heard many Israelis say, if it's over, then give us a break. It's over now, and don't bother us with this two-state solution. Let's move on to something else. And I think there is a sense in which 10 years from now, I suspect people are going to keep saying, well, we have last chance for a two-state solution.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want to talk much more about this in overtime. As regular viewers and listeners know, we generally do a good long conversation for the public, and then go into a session that is for the paid subscribers of the Nonzero newsletter, which anyone can become. There's an unpaid version of subscription and a paid version. You just go to Nonzero. There will be a post corresponding to this podcast there, and that's one way to become a paid subscriber, and then you can set up your own podcast feed, and forevermore you'll automatically get access to overtime, or you can just view it and listen to it right there. Rob, you've been kind enough to say you'll stick around for overtime, and I'm glad because I got a lot to ask you about, including Iran, your own personal experiences, including that inaccurate Hamas report. Report about Hamas that got you into hot water, and just a lot of stuff. But before we go into overtime, I want to give you a chance to say anything else about the book. Again, it's I'm not aware of a book that does such a good job of presenting the perspectives on both sides and the places where the failure to see the perspective on the other side bore a cost. What else do you want to say?
No, I think you summed it up, and you started with this whole notion of cognitive empathy. I think it really is sort of what resonates throughout the book is this notion that the conflict has been misdiagnosed mainly by outsiders for so long because there's inability to put yourself in the shoes of the two sides, and so this temptation to project one's own views of what the conflict is, what it's about, and how it should be solved. And again, if we chose to call it Tomorrow's Yesterday, it's because part of what we just lived, the years of the peace process, the diplomatic process was a bit operating in a vacuum, completely detached from what was happening on the ground. It was sort of a parenthesis that we need to not forget, but put to the side. And we are back to the days in some terrible ways. As I said, another Nakba, another catastrophe for the Palestinians. Israel is feeling a bit alone and a pariah in the international community. Support for Palestinians that is coming from sometimes unexpected quarters, but the Palestinians also without a leadership, adrift, without knowing where they're going, and neither Palestinians or Israelis being able to put forward a vision of how the two sides can live together. And that's been a theme since 1948 or even before 1948. So we're back to where we were. And if I end with this note, again, this may sound like a very pessimistic message. And our hope is for people to take from this, if they read the book, not a message of pessimism, but of let's put to rest the fake optimism. And this is a time when Israelis and Palestinians are going to have to get together as they did in the past and try to explore. And I don't mean officially, but I mean courageous Israelis, courageous Palestinians going to have to rethink where they go. And I think for the U.S., and this would really be my last note, for the U.S. to try to take stock, and I don't much hope for the Trump administration, but for the next generation to take stock of what role the U.S. played in, rather than correcting the asymmetry and trying to get out of the status quo, ended up providing protection to Israel, giving false hope to the Palestinians, telling the Palestinians, because there's this peace process, here's all these other tools that you shouldn't use. civil disobedience, international justice,
Uh-huh.
international law. All of those are
Mhm.
enemies of the peace process, so you need to continue with us. And so the US ended up perpetuating the status quo, claimed it wanted to change. I do think I'm now teaching. There's a new generation of Americans who I think are looking at this, looking at the double standards, the hypocrisy, the incompetence, the fecklessness, and saying to themselves, maybe when we're in power, if they're in power, things could be different. So that's the message of hope, is to think about this differently and with greater empathy and understanding of the perspectives of all sides.
Yeah. Okay. So the book is Tomorrow is Yesterday, Life, Death, and I'm trying to read
The
my
pursuit of peace.
audiobook version. Life, Death, and the Pursuit of Peace in Israel-Palestine, by Robert Malley and Hussein Agha. I wish I could hold up the book, but all I can hold up is the audio version because I listened to it. It kind of looks like that.
You know what?
It looks remarkably like a
Here goes.
smartphone with a small.
We can see it here.
There's the book. There's the book. Good work. We'll try to make that the screenshot.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks to everybody for staying with us this far. I hope you'll join us in overtime. I'm looking forward to that, and we're going into overtime.